In the Akan language, Sankofa means go back and get it. It is not wrong to go back for that which has been forgotten. If you walk along Chestnut Street, you'll see the signs marking the African burying ground. The signs tell a small piece of the story of African American people in our community in the 18th century. Among other things, the markers inform passersby that the soil beneath this unassuming city street is the final resting place of a number of Portsmouth's earliest black residents. Above the words on each sign, there's an image, an elaborate curly-Q heart on a red background. The heart is an Ndinkra symbol, like many of these, a symbol of the Akan people of West Africa. The Akan lived primarily in Ghana and the Ivory Coast, and for much of their history, the majority of them did not know how to read or write. But like all peoples, they found ways to transmit the values and practices of their culture from generation to generation. One way they did this was through these Ndinkra symbols, which are simple woodcut shapes that were and still are used to decorate fabric, pottery, and even coins. Each symbol is associated with a word or a saying. The word Sankofa literally translates as go back and get it, and it's associated with that lovely proverb I just shared earlier. It's not wrong to go back for that which has been forgotten. There are two different Sankofa images in common usage. One is the heart symbol that has become a logo for the African burying ground. The other is a simple image of a bird looking backward toward her tail and holding an egg in her mouth. The underlying message is that when we return to the past to retrieve something of value that we've lost or forgotten, we reclaim our future. There's a poem I love by folk singer Ani DeFranco. It's called Fuel, and it begins, they were building a new foundation in Manhattan, and they discovered a slave cemetery there. It ends, am I headed for the same brick wall? Is there anything I can do about anything at all except go back to that foundation in Manhattan and dig deeper this time? The song came out in 1998, several years after the government broke ground on a new federal building in Lower Manhattan. When construction workers were digging, they unearthed human remains that turned out to be part of a massive cemetery for people of African descent dating back to the 17th century. The story's familiar. Like our African burying ground on Chestnut Street, the discovery wasn't really new. Historical records had already testified to its presence, and like our burying ground, it was located on what had once been the outskirts of town, before an expanding city swallowed up the land. There's a memorial in Lower Manhattan now, acknowledging the presence of African American people in the ground beneath the city and in the earliest history of the city. Soon, there will be one in our city as well. It is not wrong to go back for that which has been forgotten. However daunting it may seem, it is not too late. In 1963, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and gave one of the most beloved speeches in American history. Usually, when I speak or write about Dr. King, I steer clear of the I Have a Dream speech. It is brilliant, and it is beautiful, and it was a precise ministry to the troubled soul of our country. But it's already so well known that I prefer to reflect on other writings. Today, though, this familiar speech is particularly appropriate for our topic. Dr. King begins by recalling the Emancipation Proclamation and calling attention to the searing injustices of segregation in the South and racial discrimination throughout the United States. We've come here, Dr. King declares, to dramatize a shameful situation. And then he goes on, in a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, and I would add women, yes, black as well as white, would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's obvious today, he goes on, that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring the sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check. A check that has come back with insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vault of opportunity in this nation, and so we've come to cash this check. A check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice. Our nation had forgotten from its very beginning that the great promise of equal justice was the birthright of all her citizens, of all races and genders. The leaders of the civil rights movement reminded us rather painfully that in our haste to establish ourselves as a nation, we've left behind our integrity and the singular beauty of our founding principles. The leaders of the civil rights movement gave us the inspiration and the courage to go back and retrieve them. I was not yet born when all of this was going on. My mother was just 16 when Dr. King spoke on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. But I'm captivated by the challenges and triumphs of that era. The civil rights movement is a redemption story that defies the odds. The men and women who participated revealed corruption at the core of our social and economic systems. Through nonviolent action, they exposed as a lie the story that segregation was a benign institution that benefited both black and white. Many of us already do that. By their actions, they revealed to the world that our entire social structure was built on the threat of violence and the willful denial of basic civil rights to a whole class of people. It is good to go back for that which has been forgotten, but the journey will not always be easy. Abraham Joshua Heschel was one of those that participated in the movement. He marched with Dr. King from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery to force the American government to support voting rights for African Americans in the Deep South. Heschel was a Holocaust survivor, a rabbi, and a brilliant theologian. He wrote a book called The Prophets, in which he explores in depth the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, Isaiah, Micah, and the like. He describes the biblical prophets as men who see and hear differently than the rest of us. Where the average person might walk into an architecturally beautiful city and marvel at the loveliness of the buildings, the prophet sees those same buildings with different eyes. The prophet might recognize the suffering of the men and women who built them, or the brutal wars that produced the wealth that financed their grandeur. Prophets, in other words, are kind of a pain in the neck. They point out truths we would generally prefer to keep hidden. It was the prophet Habakkuk who said, "The stones of the walls cry out, and the beams of the woodwork respond." The nature of mistakes is that it's possible to make one in an early phase of a great endeavor, like, say, building a nation, and then end up building on and around that mistake until the prospect of correcting it seems absolutely terrifying. Luckily, the leaders and the participants in the civil rights movement were bold. The stated mission of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was nothing less than to redeem the soul of America. What's amazing about the civil rights movement is that against the odds, they succeeded. We shifted. We were able to turn a corner in U.S. history and recreate a nation more grounded in the soaring affirmations we profess. We are clearly not entirely there. But there was so much progress in just the space of 15 years, thanks to the vision and commitment of a generation of activists, a generation of pesky prophets, calling us back to our best selves. Thanks, I'm guessing, to some of you in the room today. They, perhaps you, pointed a pathway toward freedom for us all. Equity and economic opportunity for Black Americans, and release for white Americans from the debilitating snare of self-deception. There was a quote on one of these flyers that said, "Society's punishments are small compared to the wound inflicted to our souls when we look the other way." When we have courage to go back and retrieve what has been lost or forgotten, we lay claim to a more beautiful future for ourselves and for those that come after us. Here in the North, it's easy to forget that the difficult issues of racial justice have also played out on our home turf. African people have lived and worked in the Northeast since the 17th century, when the first slaves were brought here by the Dutch. Slave labor helped build the cities of the Northeast and build out the servant class even here in New Hampshire. And yet that history tends to disappear. It's estimated that the African American burial ground they rediscovered in New York City contained between 15,000 and 20,000 people spread out over 6 acres. Around the time of the Revolutionary War, it's estimated that people of African descent represented between 20 and 25% of the total population of New York City. New York had the largest population of slaves around the Revolutionary War of any city in the country, second only to Charleston, South Carolina. And the slave trade was significantly engineered from here in the North, as we learned from the wonderful symposium sponsored last year by the Seacoast African American Cultural Center. Northern investors built ships and planned routes and made their fortunes investing in southern industries that depended upon slave labor. The northern roots of the slave trade and the presence of African Americans in early New England have been given little attention in the history books. In the book, Black Portsmouth co-author Valerie Cunningham tells of some confusing experiences she had as a young person. Valerie worked after school at the public library and encountered references to black people in Portsmouth in the earliest days of the city, but she had never learned about such things in school. We teach these things now. Somewhere along the line, the story of black people in our forming city were glossed over and quite literally paid over. But the records were there. There was actually a small plaque marking the burying ground when construction workers began to dig in Chestnut Street. Still, it seemed to come as a surprise when the diggers unearthed human remains during a routine sewer project. This time, though, the community responded with a lot of grace. Researchers in the descendant community were called in. Prayers were prayed and vigils held. New signs were created with more detailed information, and plans were launched for a memorial. We turn back to reclaim our history, our connections to one another, our story as a people. We turn back because we can taste the beauty of a more hopeful future on our tongue. Sankofa means go back and get it. Can you say it with me? Go back and get it. And join me, if you wish, in a responsive litany of hope. For an economic structure grounded in an ethic of compassion and justice. Respect for the sacred bonds of family and friendship. Awe at the beauty and worth of all people. Humility and courage that allow us to correct our course when we have strayed from our values. Care for the living and respect for the dead. Homecoming. The assurance that we belong to one human family with a shared destiny. It is not wrong to go back for what has been forgotten. It is not too late. It is not too wrong to go back. It is not wrong to go back for what has been forgotten. It is not too late. There is no need to repeat the mistakes of the past. Again, Ani DeFranco, am I headed for the same brick wall? Is there anything I can do about anything at all except go back to that corner in Manhattan and dig deeper this time? Down beneath the impossible pain of our history, beneath unknown bones, beneath the bedrock of the mystery, beneath the sewage systems and the path drains, beneath the cobblestones and the water mains, beneath the traffic of friendships and street deals, beneath the screeching of kamikaze cab wheels, beneath everything I can think of to think about, beneath all, get out, beneath the good and the bad and the stupid and the cruel, there's a fire just waiting for fuel. There's a fire just waiting for fuel. May we go out into the waiting day and the waiting year held in the warmth of community and a light with a passion for justice. May it be so.